I never thought that a simple weekend retreat to my friend's lakeside cabin would end up being the day I lost everything, or so I thought. When I pulled up to my house, the home I had poured my soul into for 40 years, I noticed the front lawn first. My rose bushes were trampled. My pots of lilies and lavender, the ones I'd nurtured since my husband passed, lay smashed in the driveway. And right there, in the middle of it all, my clothes, my photo albums, even my late husband's old fishing rod were piled like a mountain of trash. I stepped out of my car, my knees wobbling so badly I had to grip the door just to stay upright. I remember thinking, surely this is a mistake. Surely they wouldn't. But then I saw the note, taped right to the front door like a slap to the face. "I'm sorry, Mom. My wife's parents are moving in with us. There's no room for you anymore. I hope you understand." My own son's handwriting. Neat, confident, like it always was on his old school essays I used to proofread late at night. Neighbors stood frozen across the street. Mr. Holbrook's wife clutched her gardening gloves to her chest. The Johnson kids watched, wide-eyed, from their porch. I could feel their pity, their curiosity, like needles against my skin. I knocked on the door once, softly at first. No answer. Then I pounded, my heart thudding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Finally, the door opened, just a crack. My son peeked out, expression cold and almost embarrassed. He avoided my eyes, shifting his weight like a guilty teenager caught sneaking in past curfew. "Mom, it's better this way," he mumbled. Behind him, his wife appeared, arms crossed. She sneered like she was watching a stray dog beg for scraps. "You've had your time here," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut flesh. "We need the space. My parents deserve comfort in their old age." My lips parted, but no words came out. I tried to remember the last time I'd asked for anything. A favor, a bit of help. And I couldn't. I had cooked for them, cared for their son when he was sick, gave up traveling so I could babysit my grandson after school, all without a second thought. My son reached out, not to comfort me, but to push the door closed. I heard the lock click, a final, echoing sound that seemed to bounce inside my skull. I stood there in the June heat, sweat rolling down my spine, my trembling hands clutching that note like a lifeline. All I could think was, they loved my house more than they ever loved me. And just like that, I knew I was done. Not defeated, not broken, but done. Being alone is better than being used. I took a deep breath, wiped the tears that were threatening to spill, and picked up my old suitcase from the pile. One small bag. That's all I needed now. As I walked away, I felt every stare from the neighborhood pierce into me. But for the first time in decades, I felt a dangerous sort of calm bloom in my chest. I sat on a cracked green bench at the edge of Riverside Park, clutching my suitcase like it was the last piece of solid ground in my life. Birds chirped around me, the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaves. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. Children ran past. An old man tossed breadcrumbs to pigeons. A young couple argued quietly over a spilled coffee. And there I sat, invisible. I glanced down at my trembling hands, still smudged from picking up my dirtied photo albums and my husband's fishing rod. My hands used to be strong, the same hands that planted every hydrangea in that yard, that kneaded bread every Sunday morning so my son would wake to the smell of home. I thought about the mornings in that house, the hush before dawn when I'd slip into the garden with a cup of black tea, the dew wetting my slippers. I could almost hear my grandson's small feet pattering down the hallway, his sleepy voice calling, "Grandma, can I help you water the roses today?" I gave them everything. I gave up weekend trips with my friends because my daughter-in-law needed a break. I skipped retirement cruises because my son's business was struggling, and I thought my savings could keep him afloat. I missed birthdays, reunions, all because someone needed me to stay behind and hold things together. And yet today, they wouldn't even open the door. I pulled out a crumpled tissue from my pocket and dabbed at the sweat on my forehead, pretending it was only sweat. An older woman walking by gave me a sympathetic look but didn't stop. I didn't blame her. Who wants to get tangled in someone else's humiliation? I don't know how long I sat on that park bench after the sun dipped below the trees. My thoughts felt like they were made of fog, floating and crashing into each other. But somewhere in that haze, things started to become clear. I started replaying every conversation I'd ever had with my daughter-in-law. I remembered her fake sweet tone whenever guests were around, the way she called me mom just loud enough for others to hear. But behind closed doors, it was always, "You really shouldn't let him eat so many sweets," or "Your decorating style is so old-fashioned, we should modernize." And the hints. God, they'd been there for so long. The small comments about downsizing when my son lost a client at work. The jokes at dinner about how cozy it would be if her parents moved in someday. I remembered how she'd once looked me straight in the eye and said, "You know, when we finally make this house ours, we'll turn your gardening shed into a guest spa." At the time, I had forced a laugh, thought she was just talking big, as she always did. But now, that memory felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. And my son, my own boy who used to run to me after every scraped knee, who used to fall asleep on my lap with his breath warm against my neck. He had been slipping away for years, hadn't he? When she entered his life, he started coming to me less for advice and more for money. Each "thank you, Mom" became emptier, like a formality he checked off a list. I thought I was helping. I thought I was keeping the family together. But sitting there, replaying those moments, I realized they had been planning this slow exile for a long time. They didn't want me there anymore. They wanted the house, my house, the place where my husband and I spent every anniversary cooking steaks out on the back patio, where my grandson had learned to ride a bike, where I planted my first rosebush the year we moved in. My lips curled into a bitter smile. What a fool I had been, believing that family loyalty was enough to keep me safe. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, but it wasn't grief this time. It was something else. Something harder, sharper. A decision beginning to crystallize. A street lamp flickered to life nearby, illuminating the thin lines on my hands. I had earned every one of them, every wrinkle, every scar. I had been the backbone of that family for decades. I had been the one up at midnight when my son was sick. I had been the one who never left, no matter what. And this was my reward. I folded the photo of my grandson carefully and slid it back into my purse. No more illusions. No more excuses for them. I stood up slowly, feeling my knees protest, but I didn't mind. Each step I took away from that bench felt lighter than the last. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew this. They thought they'd won. They thought they had finally gotten rid of me. They had no idea that I was just getting started. The next morning, I found myself at a tiny diner tucked behind the main street. It smelled like burnt coffee and old memories, the kind of place that felt safe in its shabbiness. I sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea I hadn't even sipped. I stared out the window, watching people hurry past, each carrying their small burdens, each living in their own little world. That's when I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Martha?" I turned slowly, and there she was, Janet, my old friend from the neighborhood committee. She was holding a paper bag of cinnamon rolls, her eyes wide with shock and something else, pity. "Oh my God, are you okay?" she asked, sliding into the booth without waiting for an invitation. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Janet reached out and squeezed my hand. That small kindness, that single warm touch, was enough to make the dam inside me crack for just a moment. I forced it back before it spilled over. "They kicked you out, didn't they?" she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I stared at her, stunned. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice even more. "I wasn't going to say anything, but I overheard your daughter-in-law at the farmer's market a few weeks ago. She was telling someone they were planning to sell the house once you were out of the way. I thought she was joking. I mean, who does that to their own family? But she seemed so matter-of-fact about it, like she'd already decided your future for you." My stomach twisted. A sour, heavy knot formed in my chest. Janet shook her head slowly, her face a mixture of anger and sadness. She said they were going to use the money to pay off her parents' debts and finally live comfortably. She even bragged about how easy it would be since you were so trusting. My fingers curled into the sides of my mug until my knuckles turned white. Janet squeezed my hand again. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I didn't know how. I'm so sorry. I let out a long, shaky breath. I felt the world tilt slightly, as if the floor beneath me was no longer solid. They loved my money more than me, I whispered, the words tasting like acid on my tongue. For a moment, I saw my son's face as a boy, chubby cheeks, bright eyes, clutching my hand tightly whenever he got scared. I saw him standing proudly at graduation, hugging me so fiercely I thought my ribs might crack. Where did that boy go? I pressed my hand to my heart, trying to steady the storm inside me. My whole life, I believed love meant sacrifice, that if I just gave enough, they'd understand my worth. But standing there, I realized, love without respect isn't love at all. It's a transaction. Janet looked at me with tears welling in her eyes. What are you going to do now? I lifted my chin slowly, my voice calm and certain, as though it was coming from some deep well inside me I had long forgotten existed. I'm going to get my life back, I said. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt, feeling a strange strength bloom inside my ribs. Janet nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. Good. About time. I took the long walk downtown, passing shops that had already gone dark for the night. My feet ached, my shoulders burned from carrying the suitcase. But each step felt strangely purposeful, like I was pressing deeper into some hidden part of myself I'd long ignored. When I finally reached the Arts District, I paused in front of a red brick building tucked between a gallery and a tiny flower shop. The sign above the door simply read, Studio 7. Years ago, before I gave up everything for family, I worked as a part-time art assistant at a community center. The director had always admired my dedication, so much so that she helped me secure a small studio apartment as part of a staff housing program. I'd held on to it, paid the minimum rent each year, kept it as my quiet escape. I almost forgot I even had the keys until that night, when my fingers found them deep in my purse. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled of old paint and dried flowers. The windows were dusty, the furniture sparse, just a small bed, a kitchenette, a worn-out armchair, but it felt like a sanctuary. I set my suitcase down and walked to the narrow window, peeking out over the alley below. For the first time that day, I exhaled without feeling like my lungs were full of glass shards. I kicked off my shoes and stretched my tired feet on the cool floor. There, in the dim light, I allowed myself to imagine no screaming voices, no demands, no walking on eggshells to keep someone else's fragile ego intact. I closed my eyes and remembered my husband's voice. Quiet doesn't mean weak, Martha. Remember that. And that's when the plan began to form. Not a wild revenge, not a dramatic showdown in front of neighbors. No, something quieter, smarter. I would let them think they had won. I would let them believe I was defeated and small. Meanwhile, I would gather everything. My old tax records, property deeds, marriage certificates. Every piece of paper that proved the house was still legally mine. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to an old contact. Richard, my husband's best friend, now a retired lawyer. I hadn't called him in years. My finger hovered over the call button. My chest tight. Then I pressed it. His groggy voice answered after the second ring. Martha, is everything all right? A small, calm smile spread across my face. Richard, I said softly, my voice steady for the first time all day. I think I'm going to need your help. Can you meet me tomorrow? He didn't ask questions and just said, okay. I pushed myself up and stretched, feeling each stiff joint loosen slowly. I shuffled to the kitchenette, filled the small kettle, and set it on the ancient stove. As it hissed to life, I rested my hands on the counter, staring at the chipped tiles. My late husband's voice echoed in my mind again, those same words he'd repeated during late-night talks at the kitchen table. Don't sign away what's yours, not even to family. Love without respect isn't love at all. Back then, I thought he was being dramatic. I believed my son would never betray me, that family was stronger than greed. But as the steam rose from the kettle that morning, I understood every word. I thought about the day he convinced me to put the house deed partly in our son's name, for tax benefits and to secure the future. I remembered the gentle insistence, the promises. Now, every legal document felt like a rope they'd tried to wrap around my neck. I took my tea over to the small table and pulled out a battered notebook I found in one of my old boxes. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but inside were notes from my husband, reminders about the property, expenses, small maintenance logs, even old lawyer contacts. I ran my fingers over his handwriting. Each line felt like a quiet reassurance. You're not alone. You're not powerless. I knew that taking them on wouldn't be easy. They had convinced themselves that I was weak, that I would roll over rather than fight. But they didn't know what I had sacrificed to keep that house. The jobs I turned down, the friendships I lost, the nights I stayed awake worrying about how to cover the mortgage when my husband fell ill. They didn't know that house was my entire life's work. A calm, steady determination settled over me as I flipped through the pages, highlighting names and numbers. My fingers no longer trembled. I arrived at the downtown cafe early the next morning, my old brown coat buttoned tight even though the air was already warming up. It was a small place tucked behind a bookstore, the kind of spot you wouldn't notice unless you knew to look. Inside, the smell of roasted coffee beans wrapped around me like a blanket. I chose a table by the window and ordered a pot of jasmine tea. While I waited, I looked out at the early shoppers and dog walkers drifting past. Richard shuffled in a few minutes later, wearing a slightly wrinkled blazer and holding his old leather briefcase. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He spotted me and broke into a soft smile. "Martha," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. "You look different, stronger." I let out a small laugh, surprised by how true it felt. "Maybe I am," I replied. We sat there for a few minutes, the silence thick but not uncomfortable. When the waitress brought my tea and his coffee, I took a deep breath and pulled out my stack of documents. He listened patiently as I explained everything, how they threw me out, the note on the door, the piles of my life's memories on the lawn. His expression shifted from surprise to quiet fury. "They thought you wouldn't fight back," he murmured, tapping one of the deeds with his finger. "But these documents, they're still in your name. The main title. They can't sell anything without your signature." A warmth bloomed in my chest. Not relief exactly, but a first flicker of real power. Richard went on, his voice low and steady. "We'll file an immediate injunction to stop any transfer attempts. After that, we can clarify your full ownership and serve them a legal notice. You'll be back in control." I nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Then he leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "But Martha, you need to be prepared. They're going to come at you harder when they realize you're not disappearing quietly." I swallowed, feeling the weight of it. But instead of fear, there was a cold, steady resolve in my gut. "Let them come," I said. "They've already taken everything they could from me. There's nothing left for them to break." We went through each page together, marking the important details. As he scribbled notes, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I barely recognized the woman staring back. There were still lines on my face and gray streaks in my hair, but behind my eyes was something unshakable. I thought about the life they tried to take from me. The evenings tending my roses, the smell of fresh bread drifting through the halls, the echoes of laughter that used to fill those rooms. They didn't deserve it. After we finalized the paperwork plan, Richard patted my hand gently. "You're doing the right thing, Martha," he said. "It's time they learned you're not the woman they imagined." I squeezed his hand, feeling stronger than I had in years. As I stepped out of the cafe, into the bright morning sun, I felt a sudden surge of energy. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was fighting. I was back at my studio that night, folding documents into a neat stack, when my phone buzzed. My son's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the answer button. Part of me wanted to let it ring out, to hold on to the silence I had finally reclaimed. But I answered. "Mom," he said immediately, his voice tight, as though he were trying to force concern into it. "Where are you? We've been worried." I almost laughed. Worried? After tossing me out onto the lawn like a broken chair, he dared to play the worried son. "I'm fine," I said, my tone flat, giving him nothing to latch onto. There was a pause on the other end. I imagined him pacing, running a hand through his hair like he did when he was lying. "Listen," he continued, "I think we all got a bit heated. We didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. Can we meet? Just to talk." I felt a sour taste rise in my mouth, but I agreed. I wanted to see his eyes when he realized what he'd lost. We arranged to meet at a diner downtown, the same one where I'd first heard the truth from Janet. I arrived early, taking a booth by the window. The server set down a cup of tea, and I watched the steam curl, thinking of all the meals I'd cooked for him, the hands I'd held when he cried as a boy. When he finally walked in, he looked more tired than I'd ever seen him. His wife was right behind him, her face sharp and alert. They slid into the booth across from me like two actors stepping onto a stage. "Mom," he started, reaching across the table for my hand. I pulled it back, folding it in my lap. His eyes flickered. "We wanted to apologize," he said quickly. "It was a misunderstanding, really. We just thought it would be easier if we—" "Easier for who?" I cut in, my voice calm but slicing right through his rehearsed script. He swallowed, glancing at his wife. She took over immediately. "We're under a lot of stress, you know that," she said, her voice honeyed and thin. "My parents have nowhere to go, and we thought, well, since you're so independent, maybe you wouldn't mind staying elsewhere for a while." I watched her closely, her carefully chosen words slipping around the truth like oil on water. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. "These are some final property transfer papers," she said smoothly. "We thought maybe if you signed them now, it would clear everything up and we could all move forward as a family." I looked at the envelope for a long moment. My hands itched to tear it apart. Instead, I smiled faintly, pushing it gently back toward her. "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my voice even. She forced a laugh, though her eyes hardened at the edges. "Of course. We knew you'd be reasonable." My son finally looked up at me then, really looked. For a brief second, I saw a flash of something. Guilt, maybe. Or just the realization that he no longer knew the woman sitting across from him. I finished my tea slowly, rising before they could say more. As I walked out, I heard my daughter-in-law hiss. "What did she mean she'll think about it? She's supposed to sign today." I pushed open the diner door and stepped into the cool evening air, feeling a quiet surge of triumph rise through me. Let them scramble. Let them squirm. They thought they could buy my silence with one last signature. But I wasn't for sale anymore. When I got back to my studio that night, I set the unsigned documents on the table like they were a pile of rotting food. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. It was all there in black and white, the legal jargon, the signature lines, the small print betrayals. In that moment, a deep, steady calm settled over me. I felt like I had stepped out of a fog. I walked into the kitchen and began boiling water for tea. The tiny kettle whistled shrilly, but I moved slowly, deliberately, measuring out each step like a ritual. I took down an old tin of jasmine tea leaves and let them steep, inhaling the gentle floral scent. As I waited, I pulled out a worn photo album I had salvaged from the lawn that day. I flipped through each page carefully, pausing on a photo of my husband in the backyard, holding up a basket of fresh tomatoes. Another of my grandson holding a sparkler on a summer night, eyes wide with joy. My hand hovered over their faces, and for the first time since that awful day, I didn't feel pain. I felt anchored. I understood then that I hadn't just lost a house. I had lost the illusion of family. They had taught me, finally, and brutally, that love without respect is nothing but a cage. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Then, I picked up my phone and dialed Richard. My voice didn't shake. "Richard," I said, steady as stone. "I'd like to go over the papers again tomorrow. I'm ready to list the house for sale, on my terms." There was a pause on the line before he answered, his voice tinged with cautious admiration. "You're sure?" "Yes," I replied firmly. "I've spent my life patching holes for people who never thanked me. This is mine. It's time I decide how the story ends." I hung up and set the phone down carefully, almost reverently. Then I went back to the table, took a pair of scissors, and sliced straight through the unsigned transfer documents. Each snip felt like cutting an invisible tether. When I finished, I swept the pieces into the trash, wiped my hands on a dish towel, and sat back down at the table. I took another sip of tea, feeling the faint tremor of excitement in my fingers. In that small, quiet kitchen, surrounded by cracked tiles and dusty blinds, I felt more powerful than I ever had in that big house full of polished floors and staged smiles. I looked at the photo album again, tracing the edge of my grandson's face. "They'll miss me," I whispered into the dim room. "But they'll only miss me because I finally said no." I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the night city sounds outside. Distant horns, muffled music, the hush of strangers living their lives. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like a mother or a wife or a caretaker. I just felt like Martha. The next morning, I got up before the sun even started to touch the tops of the buildings outside my studio window. I grabbed my purse and the old manila folder holding my property documents, then set off for Richard's office downtown. He greeted me with a tired but genuine smile, ushering me inside before the city fully woke up. We spread the papers out on his big oak desk. "We'll move quickly," he said, tapping the corner of the folder. "I have a trusted realtor friend who can list it discreetly. They won't know a thing until it's too late." I nodded, feeling each word settle into my bones. He started making calls right away. As he did, I sat there in the leather chair by the window, looking down at the early morning commuters flooding the streets. For so many years, I thought of those busy crowds as something separate from me, something I was too old, too invisible to belong to. But today, I felt more alive than all of them. When Richard hung up, he looked at me over his glasses. "It's done," he said softly. "The house is officially listed. We've kept it under a private listing for now, to avoid alerting them. But offers will come fast. That house has value beyond their shallow imagination." I exhaled, my shoulders dropping for the first time in days. "Thank you," I said, my voice catching for a moment. He shook his head, eyes kind but serious. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to see this through. But Martha, I'm proud of you." I pressed my lips together, feeling the warmth rise to my cheeks. After the paperwork was secured, I stopped by a small fabric shop on my walk home. I hadn't touched my sewing supplies in years, but something in me craved the steady, focused work of it. Back at the studio, I pulled out an old patchwork quilt I'd started decades ago. I unfolded it on the table, ran my fingers over the faded squares, and began stitching. The needle moved in and out, each stitch quiet and decisive, like the moves I was making in my life now. By late afternoon, my small space felt alive again. Threads scattered across the table, soft music playing from a dusty old radio, and the faint scent of jasmine drifting from my teacup. I knew they would soon learn what I had done. I knew they would be furious, loud, pathetic in their panic. But in that room, surrounded by fabric and tea, and my own steady breath, I felt untouchable. I thought to myself, being alone is not a punishment. It's a gift they gave me when they showed me who they truly are. I finished another seam, held it up to the fading light, and allowed a small, genuine smile to bloom across my face. The following week moved slowly, but for the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to meet someone else's needs. Each morning, I rose before the sun, wrapped myself in my old robe, and brewed a pot of tea. Then I sat by the window, quilt on my lap, letting my hands move as my mind wandered. It felt like I was sewing pieces of myself back together, A few days later, I walked into Richard's office again, this time with my shoulders back and my chin lifted higher than it had been in years. He stood as I entered, his eyes scanning my face as if he barely recognized me. "Martha," he said, a surprised smile forming. "You look lighter." I smiled softly, setting my bag down on the chair beside me. "That's because I finally put the weight down," I said. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. We spread out the final batch of papers on his broad wooden desk. "These," he said, tapping the folder, "are the final sale documents. Once signed, the house will be officially sold. The money will be transferred directly to you." I looked at the papers for a moment, running my fingers across the crisp edges. For a brief second, an image flashed in my mind. My grandson running barefoot across the kitchen tiles, my husband humming while he chopped vegetables, my son laughing in the backyard as a boy. But just as quickly as the warmth came, it was replaced by the sting of that note on the door. "Don't make a scene." I inhaled deeply and picked up the pen. My signature came out smooth, my hand steady. When I finished, I set the pen down carefully. A strange rush of energy zipped through me, like I just stepped off a cliff and realized I could fly. Richard watched me with quiet respect. "It's official," he said. "The house is no longer theirs to touch or claim. You did it, Martha." I nodded slowly, a small smile flickering at the corners of my mouth. "I didn't just do it for me," I said, my voice low. "I did it for every woman who was told to stay quiet, to sacrifice, to disappear." Richard's eyes softened, and he placed his hand over mine. "You're free now," he said. Those words rang in my mind like church bells. A week after signing the final papers, the knock came on their door. It was a rainy afternoon. The kind of cold, steady drizzle that soaks into your bones, makes even the bravest people hurry indoors. But they had nowhere to hide. A court bailiff stood on the front porch, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. In his gloved hand, he held the official eviction notice. My son opened the door first. From the sidewalk, I could see his face pale instantly. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His wife appeared behind him a moment later, her face twisted in confusion and disbelief. "Mr. and Mrs. Dalton?" the bailiff asked calmly, as if he were confirming a dinner reservation. They both nodded numbly, unable to speak. The bailiff unfolded the notice and began to read in a clear, steady voice. "This residence has been legally sold. You are hereby required to vacate the premises within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in forced removal by court order." My daughter-in-law let out a strangled noise, half scream, half choke. She reached for the doorframe, as if it might hold her up. Behind them, I could see the living room. My living room. The same walls where I once hung my husband's old fishing hat. The fireplace where I taught my grandson to toast marshmallows on winter nights. I felt no sadness, only a quiet, resolute certainty. Neighbors began to gather under umbrellas, whispering, some filming with their phones. I saw Mrs. Holbrook standing across the street, her eyes wide as dinner plates. My son finally found his voice. This must be a mistake," he sputtered, stepping forward. "My mother would never." The bailiff calmly handed him a thick envelope. "All the legal documents are enclosed here. Ownership transfer, sale confirmation, eviction authorization. You may review them with your counsel if you choose." His hands shook so violently the papers nearly fell into a puddle at his feet. I watched from the corner of the street, my umbrella resting lightly on my shoulder. The rain traced down my face, mixing with a single tear I didn't bother wiping away. Not because I was sad, but because it felt like the final cleansing, the last drop washing away decades of sacrifice that had turned into chains. My daughter-in-law sank onto the doorstep, sobbing openly now. My son stood over her, stunned, silent, gripping the papers like a lifeline that was already slipping through his fingers. The bailiff turned, pinned the official notice to the front door, and nodded to the officers. They remained watchful but silent, enforcing the law I had put into motion. I stood a moment longer, breathing in the wet, heavy air. Then I turned and walked away, my steps steady, my spine straighter than it had felt in years. They thought they had buried me under shame and guilt. But I wasn't buried. I had been planted. And now I was finally in full bloom. The next day, I invited them to meet me at a cafe downtown. It wasn't just any cafe. It was the most crowded one on Main Street, the place where young professionals typed away at laptops and retirees gathered to gossip over endless cups of coffee. I arrived first and chose a table right in the center, where every eye would be able to watch. I wore my best navy coat and a pearl brooch I hadn't worn since my husband's funeral. When they walked in, they looked like ghosts. My son's eyes were sunken, darting around in frantic confusion. My daughter-in-law clutched her designer purse like it was a life vest on a sinking ship. I gestured to the seats across from me, calm as ever. They sat down without a word. The hush around us was almost deafening. Even the barista paused mid-steam. I pulled out a thin envelope from my handbag and slid it across the table. "These," I said, my voice low but clear, "are the final legal papers confirming the sale of the house. It is no longer yours to claim, and you have no right to contest it." My son reached for the envelope with shaking hands. My daughter-in-law started crying instantly, fat tears rolling over her trembling lips. I watched them, unblinking. I reached into my purse again and took out a small check. I set it gently on top of the papers. "This is a moving allowance," I said softly. "A symbolic gesture. Enough for a motel room and a few meals until you figure out your next move." My daughter-in-law let out a strangled sob, her mascara smearing as she buried her face in her hands. My son looked up at me then, really looked at me for the first time in years. His eyes were wild, red-rimmed, desperate. "Mom," he choked out. "Please, we didn't mean we thought." I held up my hand. "No, you made your choices," I interrupted, my voice firm, unwavering. "You loved the house more than you loved me. You thought I was too weak to fight back. You were wrong." The cafe was dead silent. A young woman at the next table froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. My son tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled it back calmly. "You only miss me now that I said no," I said, meeting his gaze one last time. I finished my tea slowly, savoring every sip, while they sat crumpled across from me, their world crumbling at their feet. When I stood up to leave, I placed a few bills on the table to cover my tea and walked out without looking back. Behind me, I heard her wailing, his muffled pleas, the quiet gasps of onlookers. But I didn't turn around. Outside, the city felt bright and endless. My lungs filled with air so crisp it almost hurt. I had severed the final tie. I was free. I didn't go straight home after the cafe. Instead, I walked through the city, letting the sun warm my face as I passed bookstores, flower stalls, and bustling street corners. My steps felt weightless, as if I were gliding just above the pavement. Finally, I reached Richard's office. He looked up in surprise when I stepped inside. "Martha," he said, standing quickly. "Is everything all right?" I nodded, closing the door behind me. "I want to make one more change," I said, my voice steady but edged with something fierce and final. I sat down across from him and pulled out the thick folder containing all my financial documents. "I want to redirect all the remaining inheritance and the house proceeds," I said. "Set up a trust fund for elderly support programs, shelters for women in crisis, something that will actually help people who need it, not people who see me as a walking wallet." Richard stared at me, stunned. Then, slowly, a proud, almost fatherly smile spread across his face. "You're sure?" he asked softly. I looked at him, really looked. "They only loved my money," I said. "Now they won't have either." Richard leaned forward, nodding as he began drafting the paperwork immediately. We spent the next hour going over every detail. Each time I signed a page, I felt a shackle fall away from my heart. When the last signature was done, Richard exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath the whole time. "It's done," he said. "They'll receive a formal notice tonight." I stood up and gathered my bag, feeling lighter than I had in decades. "Thank you," I said. My voice trembled then, the first crack in my armor, but it wasn't weakness. It was relief. He nodded, eyes shining. "You did something extraordinary today, Martha." I left the office as the sky turned gold, streaked with the first hints of sunset. That night they received the notice. A courier hand-delivered the envelope to their temporary motel room. Inside, they found an official letter stating that every cent they had expected to inherit had been redirected. No safety net, no easy landing. Just the echo of their own choices, finally returned to them. I imagined them tearing through the pages, eyes wild, their voices rising in panic. I pictured my son throwing the papers across the room, his wife sinking to the floor, sobbing into her designer sleeves. The calls started that same night. I watched my phone light up again and again on the small kitchen counter, each time flashing his name. I didn't answer. Then came the messages. Desperate, pleading. "Mom, please, we need to talk. You can't just abandon us like this. We made mistakes, but we're family." I set the phone down and continued folding the quilt I had been working on, smoothing the corners carefully. By morning, they were at my door. I heard the frantic pounding echo down the hallway, the muffled shouts through the thin studio walls. "Mom, please open up. We can fix this. You can't just leave us out here like animals." Their voices trembled, not from love but from sheer panic, the terror of losing comfort, of having to face a world that wouldn't bend for them anymore. I stood in the kitchen, breathing calmly. I didn't move. I didn't even glance at the door. After a while, the pounding turned to begging. My daughter-in-law's voice cracked, thin and desperate. "Please, we'll do anything. We can't live like this. Think of your grandson." A sharp, bitter laugh almost escaped my lips, but I swallowed it back. They only miss me now that I said no. Eventually, their cries faded into exhausted sobs, then silence. I heard their footsteps retreat down the hallway. I imagined them shuffling back to their rented motel room, heads low, eyes darting away from every neighbor's glance. Because the neighbors had started to talk, word spread fast after the eviction notice. The same neighbors who used to wave politely from their driveways now whispered behind fences. I overheard Mrs. Holbrook at the corner store, her voice sharp and disbelieving. After everything she did for them, they left her out like an old rug and thought they'd get away with it. Another neighbor shook his head, adding, "You can't treat people like that and expect no consequences." The irony wasn't lost on me. All those years I spent shrinking myself to keep peace, bending to avoid embarrassment. And now, my silence was gone. My story was loud, echoing through every street in that neighborhood. They were alone now, truly alone. Later that day, I blocked both their numbers. I deleted the voicemails without listening. I closed every door they might try to slip back through, every window they might try to pry open. As I sat down with my cup of tea and unfolded my quilt again, I felt the final piece click into place inside me. I didn't hate them. That would still mean they held space in my heart. No, I felt nothing at all. A soft, clean emptiness that felt more peaceful than any false family dinner or forced holiday smile ever had. Outside, the city moved on, uncaring and alive. And for the first time, so did I. I spent the next few weeks turning my tiny studio into something that finally felt like mine. One afternoon, as I watered a small pot of herbs on my window ledge, I looked out at the city's glow and felt no pang of loss for that big suburban house.